Hello and welcome to this InflectraCON 2023 virtual bonus session. InflectraCON will be held from April 19th through the 21st in Washington, D.C. on the campus of Gallaudet University. We are looking forward to 3 days of customer training, partner meetings, industry sessions, networking, and more. Check us out at www.inflectracon.com. This session is led by Adam Sandman, CEO and founder at Inflectra. Let's join Adam now as he starts his session entitled, Are You Scaling Agile or Failing Agile?
Hello there, this is Adam Sandman here, and I'm going to be talking today about are you scaling Agile or just failing Agile? So first, a little bit about me. Adam Sandman, and I'm the CEO of Inflectra. Welcome you here all today online at InflectraCON Virtual. And today we'll be talking about the background of Agile. Where did Agile come from? Where did we get some of its practices? Why do we need to scale Agile anyway? If Agile is doing so well, why is there's all this industry momentum towards scaling it? And what does scaling even mean? Then I want to talk about the methodologies that exist for scaling it. You may have heard of things like SAFe and other methodologies. I'm going to do a quick walk through some of those. And then lastly, I want to talk about how you can scale your Agile to adapt your organization to mitigate some of the challenges that have arisen since the Agile manifesto, but also avoid some of the pitfalls that happen when you just take an out of the box methodology for scaling. In this talk, there will be 5 takeaways. The first one is understanding Agile, its limits, and when you start using it in larger contexts, what are some of the problems? Number 2, what are some of the models that exist, pros and cons, what you can learn from them? Number 3 will be talking about how we can use Agile in a way that keeps us agile. Because as you scale Agile, the danger is you may lose what made it Agile in the first place, especially in a large company with a large bureaucracy. Number 4, talking about how you should let your needs determine how you do it. And number 5, let's talk about risks, because they're everywhere and we always forget about them till they come back and bite us. So first of all, let's take a little trip back in time in our proverbial TARDIS. For those who are not Doctor Who fans, it's a time machine in the shape of a police box. So let's go back in time a few years, maybe to about 1999, 2000. Coincidentally, when I got involved in the IT industry. And this is how we developed software back in the day. And some companies still do this today for a variety of reasons. We used to gather requirements, spend a lot of time with paper, come up with requirements. We do a business design on whiteboards or in tools, coming up with how this application should operate, independent of the technology. And then magically, we would turn that into a technical design of how the system should work. At this point, we hadn't actually written any code. We hadn't really tried anything. It was all on paper in our heads. We then would do a whole bunch of development. And in theory, we'd do a whole bunch of testing, mostly manual testing, but some automated unit testing. And usually we found that development took longer than we thought. So we had actually less time than that diagram, than this diagram shows. And then at the end, we would show it to users who would say, hey, that's what I asked for. Check the box, acceptance testing, release to the client, maybe 9 months later. Fantastic. However, problems with that. First of all, a lot of the original work that we do in a project was about gathering requirements. And requirements are things that are, we try and engineer them. We try and think about them a lot, and we try and assume that we can engineer out any issues. So a lot of the traditional processes for requirements management looks like this. We spend a lot of time talking to people, getting their needs, the standards, the regulations, all the stuff that you need to know about that client, things like the industry they're in, any constraints, any other systems they have, all of that good stuff. And then basically we would put it into a big process, and out of that would come a bunch of requirements that the client agreed with, a bunch of written down specifications of how the system should work, and some models like diagrams, things that would help us visualize the system and put all the pieces together in a logical way. Now, that's what they would look like. Requirement specification documents, something on the left like a big Word document, and something on the right, a giant spreadsheet. Could be one format or the other. They could be both formats, but a lot of paper. And generally speaking, and then you put them all together, and we trace them and turn them into hopefully a design, and then hopefully into code. And that was a theory. You go from left to right, turning requirements into code. ironically now with some of the developments in AI that we're seeing with ChatGPT, we're actually able to do some of this now. So this may change. This presentation may already be out of date. Some of this is changing. You can tell ChatGPT to write code based on a requirement. But anyway, the Agile Manifesto then said, well, there's a problem with that. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem was typically that by the time we wrote the code, by the time we tested it, if we go back to this diagram, the code was obsolete. It took too long. The testing, by the time we got to even look at the system, the client would say, this is not actually what I want. It's nothing like what I wanted. It made sense on paper 9 months ago, but now it doesn't really actually work the way we hoped it would do. And that's why systems got canceled. They were usually late because there was a lot of redesign. Once you started coding it, the business design didn't necessarily make sense. The technical design, once you started using real systems and putting them together, often didn't make sense. So a lot of that upfront work was really wasted time and wasted effort. And so the Agile Manifesto said, okay, if we know that thinking about things ahead of time will often yield the results that have to get redone anyway, and that we need to get working software. And once you see working software, people can then understand it and provide better feedback. And collaboration, therefore, is much better. And that we're going to have to change anyway. The manifesto said, well, let's take all of the bugs in the waterfall process and turn them into features. We'll make a process where previously the things that were the problem become the benefit. So if we have to talk a lot about things and redo work, let's require interaction. If we need to get working software to have any good conversations with our clients, let's get working software right at the beginning. If collaboration is super important, let's make that the most important thing. And if we know we're going to change, let's plan the change every sprint and every release, not waiting till the end. So Agile basically took the bugs in Waterfall and flipped them on their head and made them features. As part of that, we also decided to simplify what we thought as requirements. We wrote them as what we call user stories. A user story is a very simple requirement. And I know there's some argument about these are not requirements, they're user stories. I'm not getting into a holy war over that. But basically, they're a very simple user-centric way of expressing a feature. For example, as a customer, I want to be able to search for flights between 2 cities to see which ones have the best price and route. I can understand that, you can understand that, developer can understand that, tester can understand that, client can understand that. So great, something that's simple, understandable, and user-centric. And oftentimes it's written in a format, as some actor, I want something so that I can do some action. And ideally value is expressed in there. And often the role as well. Now, so that's Agile, that's user stories, we've gone back in time. So why do we need to scale Agile? If this works so well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is when we first commit with Agile, this was in 2001, 2002, and the world looked a lot like this. We had people building software in teams of about 10 people, typically in the same physical environment. If you read some of the original books, they all talk about working in a war room with the teams assembled around in the room. The clients could come in, the product owner's kind of the gatekeeper, the scrum master's keeping in charge. And every night you go out for Korean food. If you read some of the books, that's literally what they did. It was very much an interactive, co-located team of a small scale, working in hands-on, real time with the client. But as we get to larger systems, that's often not what we're dealing with. We're often dealing with a much more complex situation where we're actually scaling team of teams. So you now have multiple teams working together on a much larger system that's just more complicated. And now you have someone called a program manager who's trying to coordinate all these different teams, maybe releasing at the same time, maybe releasing at different times, but certainly with lots of connections between those teams. The output of team 1 affects the output of team 2. There are dependencies, design changes made by one team affect another team within the same core product. And we see this all the time. The second thing is we now have products and portfolios. We don't just have one product that we're releasing. We have a variety of products. An example I'm going to use, I think, throughout this presentation will be a bank. Most of us have used online banking services. Product A might be a web banking portal that we use. Product B might be the Android mobile app for banking. Product C could well be the iOS version, and product D, maybe it's a chat version, maybe it's a phone version, maybe it's the tool that the customer service agents are using to interact with those 3 other products, for example. But they're all related products. They're all to do with online banking. So it's one area of the company. It's nothing to do with mortgages or loans. It's all banking. But they are 4 distinct products, but they have to work together. And so then put that in the context of the company, and suddenly it gets even more complicated because you've got these 4 products, which are probably not the only products, probably a lot more in a large company. These products have to align with the company's strategy and objectives. So someone who's running the company, they might decide that their mission is to become the number one customer service bank in retail banking, or they're going to change the experience of banking. We've seen this with some banks turning their branches into coffee shops, and they want to make their online platform as easy to use as a social media app. They want to reinvent banking for the next generation, for example. And that's what companies do. They have to be constantly reinventing. So all the products have to align with those objectives. And we call that enterprise planning or road mapping. It's aligning the different products in your portfolio with the company's overall mission and goals. And it's not easy to do for a large company. It works much easier in a smaller organization. Also, if you're changing all these products, you've got to train your customer support team. You've got to make sure that service delivery is able to support both the infrastructure on the bottom, the IT, all the technical side of it. But on the right-hand side, the people side too has to all be integrated with that objectives. You can't be changing the products, rolling it out, and the customer service team isn't available to understand how it works. Although we have seen this happen a lot. There are some horror stories in banking that I could tell you where this did happen this way. And the product doesn't work, so people go to the customer service. They could be the backup when things don't work correctly because of an update. They don't even know the app either. So now you've got bigger problems. So therefore, we know that Agile is not by its intrinsic design able to handle some of these larger cases. But this isn't even the end of the story. This is just the beginning of the story, or maybe it's the middle. Companies increasingly are not just writing software and tools themselves. I don't think increasingly you write every line of code in your company. Neither do your developers. For the most part, you're using products and services that are from other companies as well. It could be computer libraries of code that you're getting from a third-party company. It could be that you're using a white label platform. Many banking tool companies, if you actually look at the tools they're using, that web portal that does the online banking for the web version isn't actually their own product. It's actually a white labeled generic product from a company that makes these portals for banks, especially the smaller regional banks do this. But probably the company that makes the mobile app is completely different. Someone's got to connect this to their actual data and make sure it works and so on. But ultimately, companies are interconnected with other companies that make the components. And so if you think about an analogy, look at aerospace or automotive. When you buy a car, there's like 20,000 parts, or maybe it's more than that, principal parts, and they have suppliers and sub-suppliers. So they already have this concept of a supply chain where the finished product is actually the accumulation of work being done by many, many companies all coming together to deliver that product. And increasingly, software is the same. Whether it's prepackaged applications, components, et cetera, ultimately it's the same. So we need to think really of software as a supply chain. And so this is how it looks. You have an integrated agile supply chain where increasingly the companies to the right, who are the ones delivering to the end user, and have their own business models, they're going to require the companies to the left, which are really the suppliers. They make the generic web portal, the generic customer service tool that's being rebranded, maybe components that are being bought to be integrated. They will get their directions and maybe not suggestions, maybe actual requirements and plans from the companies on the right that are using them. And they may be in competition. Maybe you're supplying 6 different banks with a web portal. All the banks compete with each other. Maybe those banks are giving you feedback. Some of that feedback can be shared. Some of that feedback can't be shared because that's going to be unique to each of the flavors of your product. It's very complicated. There's data privacy concerns. There's competitive concerns, NDAs, all kinds of stuff there. Making sure that requirements that belong to one client don't get inadvertently mixed to another client that's unique IP. Also, you've got industry regulators, data privacy authorities, and don't think they're sitting idle. In the last 5-10 years, you have seen so much more regulation when it comes to software. Especially because of the pandemic, people realize software is critical for the world's economy. It is not an afterthought. When software doesn't work, entire economies can be stalled. In the entire supply chain, the physical supply chain can break down. If banks can't lend money, you can't make payroll the next day. We saw this a few weeks ago. So software is critical to the world's economy. Therefore, industry regulators are involved and will be increasingly involved. We're only going to see more regulation around cyber, privacy, reliability, competition, antitrust, all those different things. So all of the challenges at the macro scale on the people building software working in this agile supply chain are only getting higher. So with all of that complexity and extra rules, and a methodology built for 10 people in a room, working interactively with one single client who could give unique and comprehensive directions is pretty much over. So this is why we need to scale agile. But there's other things as well. as we've used Agile in a practical setting, we've worked through it, we find there are problems with it. In general, one of the problems is that people start to do the practices without the principles. People say, we're going to have 2-week sprints because I went to an Agile coaching session and they say we should have 2-week sprints. Why should we have 2-week sprints? I don't know, but that's what we were told. Okay, again, the practice was the early feedback iterations. The principle is really more important than the practice. I don't care how many weeks your sprints are. Are you actually getting interactions and feedback and having a potentially releasable solution at the end of that sprint? That's that iteration. That's the point. We've seen teams where they do 2-week sprints, but at the end of that 2-week, they don't really have anything releasable. They say, releases aren't related to our sprints. Sprints are just for scheduling, not for releasing. Like, well, okay, that's not really the whole point. So that's one of the issues. Things of technical excellence. People build MVPs on a weak foundation. If you remember Agile, it talks a lot about MVPs. And one of the things is spike solutions. Looking at the architecture that got you to a certain scale is not the architecture that gets you to the next scale. People forget that. They just want to keep building functionality, build user stories, and not reevaluating the architecture. And a lot of executives are like, well, we're Agile. We're going to send you all to that course on Agile. We must be Agile. Get over it. So there's not a commitment to excellence at the executive level. And then on the right-hand side, when these things happen, you end up with teams that are overburdened and working long hours. And if you read a lot of the original manifesto material, it was all about sustainability and teams having the time to do the right thing and think about what they were doing, and not just being tasked. And also, as we've moved to a virtual world and people not in the same room, although we have people working very effectively during the pandemic, we're losing some of that team cohesion and team consensus, especially when people are working on multiple teams simultaneously, 2 hours there, 2 hours there. A lot of the team concept is not necessarily being adopted. And then the other thing is a weak product strategy. As we see, when you've got a program of products of teams, you have to have people in charge who understand what is the overall product strategy. What are we trying to do with these apps? Not just the next sprint or the next release, but wider than that. And Agile doesn't say you shouldn't do that, but I think people often forget. Another problem we've seen is user stories. User stories are great. They allow you and I to have a conversation that's very simple, very testable. I understand it, you understand it, and it's very much an end user perspective. So it encourages lean working. We're not writing out 400 lines of requirements that require every single sub feature. So we're building something that just about works enough to get feedback. The other idea of user stories is they're meant to be independent of each other, so that you can actually work in different schedules and different sprints, and they don't affect each other. But the problem we run into is some of the features become bugs. And we've seen certainly when people aren't in the same room, which again was sort of a theory that, sort of an assumption that Agile made, especially if testers, developers, different people working on a user story are not even in the same time zone. And we're now relying on asynchronous mechanisms like emails on a ticket or an incident or a Slack message. What we find is that people don't actually agree with what the user story meant. And so now we need to start thinking about adding more text to clarify. When you said between 2 cities, did you mean a round trip flight, or did you mean a multi-city flight or a one-way? They're both between 2 cities. Does the user get to choose? We didn't talk about that. Is that a different user story? So there's a lot of times that we find that when you start to look into actually build and test these user stories, it's not as easy to do that just with the user story. Some people are visual thinkers. And in the old days, we'd have flow charts and diagrams and wireframes, and we still can do all of those things. Nowhere in Agile does it say, thou shalt not have other things in user stories. User stories are just a tool. There are other good tools, but I think we've become very obsessed by using it and using it solely. And so visual thinkers have a hard time using them. Also, when you look back in time on a very large system that's been around for a while, sometimes it can be hard to understand what were the assumptions that were made at the time. The user story by itself, not necessarily enough to do that. And now lastly, going back to my point about regulations and regulators and all the legal stuff, when you're working in regulated environments, which pretty much means everywhere these days, GDPR, a bunch of states in the US are adopting similar privacy rules. If you're in healthcare, you've got HIPAA. If you're in medical devices, you've got CFR Part 11. If you're in automotive aerospace, you've got ISO standards. Energy, you've got NERC CIP. I could go on reading out acronyms and making acronym soup. But the reality is, a lot of times, these industries do require, by law, more detail than a simple user story. In many industries, you've got to determine the hazards, what are the things that could happen if that software fails, especially in safety environments. And if we think of software becoming much more woven into the fabric of society and our economy, it's only more important than ever that we do that. And so as a result, a simple user story may not satisfy legal regulations. So you have to write requirements. and user stories, not just one or the other. So what we found is that when we visited clients, we call it the requirements gap. We have on the left-hand side, actually start on the right-hand side. We've got the Agile team working on their Scrum boards, their Kanban boards. They've got their user stories, building away merrily. And these are the requirements that they use to build the system. My requirements. We went to a different floor in the same building, and we talked to the BA team. We're talking about them because they were looking at using our Spira product, and these are screenshots from Spira. And the team on the left-hand side, the BA team, weren't using Spira. The team on the right were. And we're like, well, what is it that you need? Why aren't using Spira? All the things are in there. And they're, well, those guys there, they don't understand requirements. They're dealing with user stories. I mean, I know they think that they are their requirements for building the system, but we have to understand, we're an insurance company. We have to understand the laws, the rules, the regulations. It's not as claims management. It's not as simple as that. So we separately come up with all of our requirements. And in the end, we kind of connect them together and look for any gaps, hopefully. Maybe not. And they were using, on the left-hand side, Word documents. On the right-hand side, they were using Spira and together with some whiteboards. And so what we found is, if you start to look at what the BA team and the Agile team need, they all need the same thing. They need a way to have a central place where all the requirements live. Some of the requirements will be more prescriptive, and some of the requirements are more agile. And they need to work together to define the system. And if you change a requirement on the left, it's going to impact things on the right. And that wasn't happening. So we need to close this requirements gap and have the Agile teams understand user stories are great, but they're not sufficient. And the team on the left needs to understand that their requirements in isolation will just sit in the box and never go anywhere. They have to engage with the team on the right. So there should never be my requirements and your requirements. There should just be requirements, whether they're user stories, features, use cases, flowcharts, screenshots, wireframes, whatever makes sense. And again, with Agile, do what makes sense, use what makes sense, use enough information and no more. And that's going to be different for every team. On the technical side, we see a similar problem, which is the MVP. A lot of times the MVP, when people build an MVP, it shows the concept of the system. So I'm building an MVP, and I'm basically going to take that MVP and use to show a client how this product can work. And the client sees the MVP and goes, I love that, let's go build it. And that's good, because the client before couldn't do that. They would look at these requirements documents and things that you did in an old waterfall project, and they had no idea what this thing would look like, would it work? Customers couldn't give feedback on it. With an MVP, you build enough that you can get feedback, and we call that conceptual risk. You're mitigating conceptual risk. The problem is, it's in many cases we're using technologies that aren't really going to scale to what the client's going to actually need. So the other parts of the MVP you're meant to be doing are mitigating the technical risk also. So conceptual risk, is this the right product? Would a customer use it? Is it going to have value? Is it the right thing we're building? And the startup, that's very common. Show someone what this thing could be. They get excited. We can raise money. We can start building this system. The problem is you also, and maybe not even showing the client, but internally, you need to start thinking about what is the technical risk. If you're building something that's going to run over a cell phone network or over a degraded network, or it's going to be used by these kinds of users, and it's going to work at this scale, making sure the technology stack you're using is also going to scale as you start to build this. And so proving out any areas of technical risk. Technical risk could be the infrastructure. It could be the integrations. We're going to need to get data from a traditional claims management system for this new, a very powerful online, insurance comparison tool that's going to change the industry. We need to get the data from a real system. Well, can we get that data? Does it exist? What format's it in? Are we allowed to get it? Proving out those pieces at the same time is really important. And Agile talks a lot about that, but typically we don't see that very much. It's usually the conceptual risk we're focused on. So that's one of the other problems with a traditional Agile, is that we don't often think about the technology till it's too late. When we show the concept, the client loves it, and then when we try and actually go to implement it, it doesn't actually scale because we didn't test out all the technical areas of risk. We used a technology platform, a programming language that the developer liked, that was quick for prototyping, some low-code thing, or maybe it was just a language that was good for building UI quickly, but we try and do large data processing isn't going to be the right choice. We're now throwing a lot of what we did away. Maybe some of the concept doesn't work. So that's some of the reasons why Agile is evolving and scaling naturally. Now, there are some off-the-shelf methodologies that claim to do this for you. And the most famous one is SAFe. This is the SAFe diagram, and it is very busy and there's lots of different things. Some of the key things it does talk about, though, which are very interesting and useful, it does talk about different levels: the team level, the program level, the large solution, the portfolio. So that maps quite closely to what we saw before. We've got teams, products, programs, large solutions, a portfolio of different products all have to work together. It talks about an enterprise planning, the company having objectives and business strategic objectives, themes, things it's trying to do, being able to choose between different investments, budgets, and portfolios. So there's a lot of good stuff in here. The problem with SAFE is just that there's a lot of stuff in here. Not every company needs all of it. And I think people get very hung up on trying to implement this and adopt some of the names, which I must admit I find a little non-intuitive, like some of the release trains and things. There's good ideas and good concepts, but just make sure you understand how it applies to you. Then there's some simpler models, the Nexus model, which is basically taking a product backlog for each of the products and then having different Scrum teams working together. And then you have integration teams. And on the top left here, this circle, the integration team is keeping those different team of teams together, a bit like the program manager in that earlier diagram. And then you have daily Scrum stand-ups, you have daily Scrums, you have reviews, and then you have the different sprints, both at a team level. And then you have this high-level product backlog for the whole integrated product of multiple teams. So it's taking the Scrum approach and kind of scaling it up. And another one you'll come across is the Scrum of Scrums, which we'll show you. And that's very similar. Another one that's interesting is the Spotify model, where you have what are called tribes, squads, and trios. And then you have like guilds. The idea there is you're building these teams which are cross-functional and they work together. So a squad is a cross-functional agile team. A tribe is a collection of those that work together on a product. And then you basically find people with the same discipline who are the same colored spots on this diagram. And they create chapters where they can work together as we're all the developers, we're all the UX people, and they can build skills. And so from a training and learning and building leadership skills, you can do that across the different teams with these chapters. And then you have alliances and guilds. So it's a very interesting model, and it tries to break down the issue between like becoming better at your discipline and working in a cross-functional team where you may be the only person with that specialty on the team. So it's an interesting model. Some other frameworks, there's the Scrum of Scrums, similar to Nexus in the sense that it deals with the Scrum team, and you have Scrum of Scrums and a Scrum of Scrums, which are basically just teams containing members of the teams from the individual teams coming together. Doesn't talk a lot about the artifacts. Like if you look at Scrum of Scrums, nowhere in there does it talk a lot about what kinds of activities you're doing. It's just much less prescriptive. It says, take what Scrum did and just do it in a series of hierarchies with a team that contains representatives from the other teams rather than the entire team. Then there's some other methodologies which are a little bit more prescriptive and defined, but not to the same level, like LESS and DAD. And the disciplined agile delivery comes from some of the other methodologies you may be familiar with. Some of the old agile unified frameworks. It was called RUP, and then it became AUP. And so this agile delivery comes from that history. So there's a lot more of a requirement focus. So if you look at DAD, some of the things it talks about there are what is the compliance requirement, as you can see. So we talk about the ones where you've got these very large regulatory products. You're dealing with critical data. Maybe you're dealing with ISO standards on the right. You're doing much less, and then you may be dealing with a much simpler problem. It might be a startup working in a relatively uncharted part of business where there aren't as many legal requirements. You can be more innovative and less prescriptive. And you also look on the domain complexity. Are we dealing with a very complex system of systems where there's lots of intricate things you have to do? Or maybe it's a straightforward web application that's going to produce some information and allow you to do a very simple task. So disciplined agile delivery tries to take the complexity and some of the prescriptions of something like a SAFe, but give you flexibility like a sliding scale. And depending on the sliding scale, you can use the appropriate level of methodology for you. So it's worth looking at. It's an interesting one. And then LESS is another methodology, which is, again, takes the idea of sprint planning and then tries to scale it up with different product backlogs versus sprint backlogs. So more on the Nexus side of things. So you've basically got these approaches, which is either taking an agile approach and just building it up, or you've got an approach where we take other previous agile ideas, non-agile ideas, and trying to figure out taking the best of them and infusing the agile approach with some of those things that worked at scale. And if you start to look at scaled agile, particularly the SAFe model, they often talk about having themes or capabilities or strategic objectives. They talk about epics, features, and stories. So even within a single product, when you start to put that together, you look at this, you get a hierarchy. You get themes that contain epics, that contain features, that contain stories. Well, the reality is what you now have is effectively a hierarchy that looks a lot like a waterfall project if you put it on its side and call it a requirements document. So that's one of the challenges. You're taking a methodology for Agile, but you're ending up with a giant waterfall set of hierarchical requirements that just have different names. And that's not the point. So how do you scale your Agile? And I use your very importantly, because it's about you. It's about your culture. So the first thing is start with, what is a minimum viable product? What is something that's going to prove out the feature you're building or this new business idea? Make sure you have a team culture that's adaptive. They're not going to take safe and say, let's do safe. They're going to adapt to the team environment as it evolves. You do need to have a centralized and unified backlog of things you're doing, because the program manager and the portfolio people who are planning the entire company need to know what the teams are working on, but we don't want them to be micromanaged. They should be working at the high level, providing guidance and prioritization, but not directing the teams directly. Well, that's just simply micromanagement and not Agile at all. And finding an Agile methodology that fits, and also understanding a lean approach where we're trying just enough to see what works and being adaptive and throwing away things that maybe worked before but don't work as we scale. And so when we say start with a strategic MVP, think about an idea that's important to the business, something that's really strategic, that's going to be drive change. We call it the dream. Then you take that dream, we turn that into the castles. These are the things that inspire people, but they're much more concrete and they realize the dream. And now start to think about how do we break that down into the big house. And then we've got this big house we're going to build. We're going to then turn it into a maintainable home. And now we're going to start thinking about what are the features that make it up. So again, I want my dream house. I want to turn that into my castle. And then, of course, when you start to think about that, well, I'm going to end up with a 2-bedroom house with a bath and a kitchen and a sink. So it's taking those ideas and distilling it down into something that's actually tangible and those are really your requirements at the end. So let's talk about the essential needs. What do we need? So projects, the teams working on projects, they need to understand the capabilities. They're building a feature, they're building a capability that someone's going to use. Let's talk about the program. The programs, they take all the different projects. So a project might be web banking. And they're thinking about what are the benefits. Well, the benefit is a customer can, whatever their device, whatever their platform, because the program contains web, mobile, and on potentially phone banking. Well, the benefit is a customer has an omni-channel way of actually connecting with their banking information and knowing in real time, wherever they are, whatever their device they're using, they can get to their banking information. That's the benefit to the customer. And then lastly, the portfolio view is what's the benefit, what's the objective to the business? And that's back to the high level question, which was asked, which is why are we doing this in the first place? Well, it's because our bank wants to redefine banking. We want to be the #1 retail consumer bank, which means we need to give people the best banking experience across all their channels, which means we need to have this online banking system work in these particular ways, going back from right to left. So that's how you tie those different levels together to deliver business value. When we start losing sight of business value and just focusing on safe or release trains and all this other stuff, we lose sight of what this is for. The tail is wagging the dog. So, okay, putting it all together at a tangible level, if we have product 1 and product 2, and then we have epics, features, and stories, how do we scale that? Well, things to consider. How connected are these two products? If product 1 and product 2 have zero connectivity whatsoever, they're literally separate things, maybe we don't need to worry about their dependencies too much. Maybe there's not an integrated value stream between them. Maybe features in 1 and features in 2 don't connect to each other. And the other thing is, can you release 1 and not release 2 at all? Would it still be useful for the client, for the end user? And if the answer is yes, then perhaps there's not a lot of considerations between the two. They could run as independent projects. On the other hand, if they're tightly coupled, releasing 1 requires release 2 to be available, then they're much more tightly coupled. Also, at a portfolio level, if we invest in product 1 and therefore we need more resources to get it released on time, and we have to pull people from product 2, will we have to pull people from product 2, or are they different developers, different teams? We're not pulling from either. So there's 2 reasons we have to think about the connectivity. One is, are the products and systems connected, the work product? And number 2, are the people and the investment that's required connected at a business level? So those are kind of the 2 ways we think about it. And if you look at SAFE, you've got large solution, which thinks about the systems connected, and portfolio, which is much more about the investments connected. If I invest here, I have to divest here. But the systems may be separate. So then what you think about is, if I put these together, I've got my program, which consists of features from the products. And what then happens is each of the green features will derive which of the gray epics will get done and which of the obviously stories and things below that get done. So as we prioritize our program backlog, if they're connected like this at a high degree of connectivity, what you're seeing is this large solution if I have to prioritize a feature in green, or maybe I change a feature in green, it's going to have ripple effects to the gray and blue features, and we need to think of that. And similarly, if a feature is late or we change a feature in the blue or the gray because we just learned something, as you do, those changes need to ripple back up, because that will change what the green looks like and when green is delivered. And then when we go one level higher than that, which is the portfolio above the programs, which is how are these programs connected? Is there one vice president in our company who's responsible for both these two programs? And unless we deliver both these two programs, he's not going to be happy. Or I guess more realistically, if we don't deliver at least these two programs together, or will we be able to deliver the value to the end user? And also, if we can't release program one, maybe program one is some infrastructure program, will it impede other programs from being delivered because they're going to rely on that infrastructure being there? And then the second question is again, like we saw with the programs, if I have to invest more in program A, will it affect the investment in program B? Is there a business investment type of trade-off? So there's again those two things: system connections. Are they integrated at a system, or APIs, or milestones? Do we have to release these together? And the second question is, if I invest in more in A, do I have to divest some in B? And which is more important if we have to do that? So these are why we need to understand the connections between these two programs. And that gives you this, which is the ability for the CFO, the CIO, at the C-suite of the organization, they can, or the VP of applications, depending on the size of your company, they can look at these different levels, and they can see, well, this capability in yellow is the most important thing for the company because it ties to our strategic vision, our strategic objective, which is one of the epics in kind of orange. And if that orange epic is not delivered, we failed as a company. Therefore, everything on the right-hand side in that other portfolio is not as important. We're going to pull back a little bit there. We're going to spend more resources on the left-hand side, and that will therefore change program B, product 3, and product 4 by necessity. And rather than just happening organically because one team's late, one team's ahead, it's giving the people at the running the company the ability to make changes, right? The whole idea of Agile is giving them the gears and the technique so that people who can make macro decisions at the top of the company, they can make decisions intelligently with good data and say, I understand that we need to do everything, but we can't. This is more important. Looking where we are, look at where we're going. I want to make a change here. The teams then can adjust from that top level direction, but you're not getting some executive coming down to the product 3 and saying, we need to change this feature because I don't like this button. Again, we don't want micromanagement, we want decision making. So the idea here is the right decision making at the right level, informed by good data. And a few other things just to close out with, there are some other requirements that we often forget. We've talked a lot about requirements and features. Don't forget bugs, don't forget technical debt, don't forget refactoring goals. And of course, no one nowadays is, but don't forget security, because those requirements, which are effectively mandatory requirements in many cases, have to be planned in and accounted for. And of course, don't forget risks. Increasingly, people are realizing this is something that we have, I think, as an industry, forgotten about. Risks, things that haven't yet happened but could happen, are something that will change the direction of all of these different plans. And so planning for risks, allowing time in your backlog to mitigate risks, to experiment with risks. Again, part of the MVP in Agile is to identify risks, both technical, conceptual, and schedule. And if we don't plan for at least in looking at risks, then our schedules and all of our plans are for nothing. So make sure you include risks in your backlogs as well. There are some things you can do to get consensus. There's lots of techniques like workshops, breakouts, UX observations. Don't just rely on user stories and people and conversations, especially when you are dealing with things that may be asynchronous, or maybe you're dealing with people in different time zones or different geos. You can't always use the same techniques for user stories and just, here's my user story. What do you think? Oh, that looks good. Let's go build it. We need to have different techniques. So be open to ideas, whether they're in person or virtual, finding ways to get consensus on the requirements, especially as you scale and this complexity can be hard. Here's some questions to ask. When we're thinking about how you design your Agile approach, can you get real users? Will you only get people who think they're real users but aren't the real users? What kind of laws, rules, and requirements, statutory requirements do you have to deal with? How complex is your domain? Do you have a BA team that's doing separate business analysis stuff, or is the Agile team responsible for all of this itself? That will change how you design your methodology and your approach. And how do people think? Do some of those personality tests? Are you visual thinkers, literal thinkers, abstract thinkers? It really depends. If you know who's on your team, you can adjust your methodology to account for that. And so here's a roadmap for requirements. Think about the breadth. at the beginning. Don't go straight into a sprint and start building something. Understand the drivers, the goals, the motivation. What are the critical success factors for this entire MVP? Decompose that into your themes, decompose that then into your stories, and then iterate. As Agile, you're being Agile, but you're doing it with a broad view at the beginning and then focusing on iterating afterwards. So here's some other things you can look at. Basically, when talking about Agile, it's not just about technology and requirements, it's also about people and processes and making sure those are aligned. Make sure your people, your process, your organization, and your technology is all aligned. So to wrap up, Waterfall was used for large-scale projects and had some success, but also had a lot of problems. Agile methodologies have taken those bugs and made them features, but now we're seeing some of the limitations of that, especially due to scale and real-time feedback and just complexity, and the world becoming just more complicated than it was then. And so as you think about how you scale your Agile approach, don't just blindly follow methodology. Look at your culture, your people, your team, look at the requirements, look at your domain you're working in, and make sure you try something that works for you. Let it build, let it scale, take feedback, and adapt as you go. And with that, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to always have a conversation about this.
Thanks for joining us for this virtual bonus session. We hope you enjoyed it. Learn more about InflectraCON, our live, in-person conference from April 19th through the 21st, 2023 in Washington, D.C. by visiting InflectraCON.com. Stay tuned for more great content, news, and events from Inflectra. Learn more at inflectra.com/company.